In a prestigious hospital's maternity ward, 3 infants bear distinctive marks that mirror a powerful man's own. Within medical records and family histories, science uncovers what privilege tried to hide. Between coincidence and destiny lies a truth that will reshape multiple lives. As genetic proof emerges, the true meaning of inheritance takes unexpected form. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of newborn cries echoing down the hall. Dr. Evelyn Reed, her eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night, stared at the 3 infant files spread across her desk. Each baby, born within a week of each other, bore the same distinctive crimson birthmark, a swirling pattern resembling a stylized phoenix. A chilling coincidence, or something more sinister? Sarah, a young mother with calloused hands and eyes brimming with a weary love, nervously clutched her baby, Leo. The nurse said it's a birthmark, but it's so vivid, she whispered, her voice trembling. The mark, a perfect mirror image of the one on the file next to her, pulsed faintly beneath Leo's delicate skin. In the adjacent room, Anna, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms, paced restlessly. Her newborn, Clara, slept soundly, oblivious to the anxiety that choked her mother. Anna, used to controlling every aspect of her life, felt a tremor of fear at the sight of the mark, identical to those on Leo and the 3rd baby's file. She hadn't even wanted this baby initially. Meanwhile, David, a struggling artist, held his daughter, Maya, close. His eyes, usually sparkling with creativity, were clouded with worry. He hadn't told anyone about Maya's mark, another flawless replica of the others, afraid it was some kind of curse. He felt the weight of responsibility bearing down on him, his own struggles amplified by his daughter's mysterious sign. Dr. Reed ran a hand through her tired hair, the weight of the mystery pressing down on her. The hospital's hushed whispers, the furtive glances exchanged by the nurses, even the stiff, almost robotic manner of Liam O'Connell's lawyer, who'd made a series of discreet inquiries about the newborns, only deepened her unease. The powerful O'Connell, a man known for his ruthlessness, was connected somehow. She just didn't know how. The phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. It was a colleague. "Evelyn," the voice said, hushed and urgent. "The genetic analysis is back. The birthmarks, they're not just skin deep. It's something far more unusual." A cold dread began to grip Evelyn. The unsettling coincidence, the whispers, and now this? The truth, shrouded in secrecy and privilege, was about to shatter the lives of 3 families and a powerful man who preferred to stay hidden. But the phoenix mark on 3 tiny babies had begun to ignite its fiery wings. The sterile white of the maternity ward felt suffocating to Sarah. The rhythmic beeping of Leo's monitor was a constant, unsettling counterpoint to the frantic fluttering of her own heart. His tiny hand, clutching her finger, was warm against her palm, a stark contrast to the chill that had settled deep in her bones since the doctor mentioned the birthmark. "It's unique," she remembered the doctor saying, her voice tight with an unsettling reticence. Across the hall, Anna, surrounded by the plush comforts of her private room, felt anything but comforted. Clara, nestled in her bassinet, slept peacefully, oblivious to the turmoil raging within her mother. The mark, a fiery crimson swirl identical to the one described by Sarah's doctor, pulsed faintly beneath Clara's skin. Anna's meticulously controlled world felt threatened, the carefully constructed facade of her perfect life cracking under the weight of this unsettling anomaly. "It's just a birthmark," she muttered, the words a desperate attempt to convince herself more than anyone else. But the fear, sharp and cold, remained. Meanwhile, in a small, sparsely furnished room, David nervously paced as Maya slept. The vibrant colors of his artist's studio seemed muted, dimmed by the shadow of worry hanging over him. The birthmark on Maya's tiny shoulder, a mirror image of the others, felt like a brand, marking his daughter with a mystery he couldn't comprehend. He cradled her gently, whispering reassurances even though he felt anything but reassured himself. His usual creative spark had flickered and dimmed under the oppressive weight of uncertainty. Dr. Reed, back in her lab, stared at the genetic analysis. The results were extraordinary, defying all logical explanation. The birthmarks weren't just skin-deep. They were linked to a unique genetic marker, a signature so specific it pointed towards a single source. A cold dread, mirroring the apprehension she saw in the mother's eyes, settled in her stomach. The whispers, the secretive inquiries from Liam O'Connell's lawyer. It was all connected. This wasn't coincidence. This was something far more significant and far more dangerous. The phone buzzed. It was the hospital administrator. His voice, usually jovial, was strained. "Dr. Reed," he began, his tone clipped and formal. "Mr. O'Connell's legal team wishes to discuss the newborns." The game, she realized, was about to begin. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air as Dr. Reed reviewed the genetic profiles, the stark fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished chrome of her lab equipment. Each profile, a stark testament to the unusual genetic marker, felt like a weight in her hands. The similarities were undeniable, a chilling echo resonating across three disparate families. Outside, the city thrummed, oblivious to the quiet revolution brewing within the hospital walls. Sarah, clutching Leo's tiny hand, felt a tremor of fear each time she looked at his birthmark. It pulsed faintly, a crimson bloom on his otherwise flawless skin. "He's perfect," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else, her voice cracking slightly. David, sitting beside her, reached out to cover her hand. His own worry was etched into his tired face, the usually vibrant colors of his life replaced by a bleak monochrome. Across the hall, Anna paced restlessly in her opulent private room, the soft glow of the nightlight casting long shadows. The luxury that surrounded her felt suffocating, a gilded cage that couldn't contain the anxieties tearing through her. Clara's birthmark, a perfect mirror of Leo's, throbbed subtly beneath the delicate skin of her tiny shoulder. Anna's carefully cultivated composure was crumbling, replaced by raw, unadulterated fear. What if there's something wrong?" she finally breathed, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the air conditioning. She looked at the sleeping infant, a fierce protectiveness warring with her growing sense of dread. The phone call from the hospital administrator broke through the tense silence. Dr. Reed listened, her gaze unwavering, as he relayed Liam O'Connell's lawyer's request for a meeting. A chill, sharper than the hospital's air conditioning, settled over her. The meeting wasn't a request. It was a demand. The game, as she'd suspected, had begun. Later, staring out at the cityscape from her lab window, Dr. Reed saw the city lights as a field of scattered stars. Liam O'Connell's looming influence felt as vast and impassable as the night sky. Yet, she felt a surge of determination. She had a responsibility, a duty to these children, these mothers. She would not be intimidated. The truth, however dangerous, deserved to be revealed. The sterile scent of antiseptic battled with the faint, sweet aroma of baby powder in the maternity ward hallway. Sarah, her eyes red-rimmed, clutched Leo close, his tiny hand gripping her finger with surprising strength. The crimson birthmark, a swirling poppy bloom on his left shoulder, pulsed faintly beneath his delicate skin. David, usually a whirlwind of creative energy, sat beside her, his vibrant spirit dimmed by a gnawing anxiety. He watched Sarah, her usually bright smile replaced by a fragile, worried expression, and silently vowed to protect her and their son, no matter the cost. "He's different," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "More special." The unspoken fear hung between them, heavier than the antiseptic scent. A soft sob broke the silence. Across the hall, Anna, her tailored suit rumpled, paced in front of her opulent private room. Clara, nestled in her bassinet, stirred. The same crimson mark, a mirror image of Leo's, adorned her tiny shoulder. Anna, the picture of composure in public, crumbled under the weight of her fear. The luxury surrounding her felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the turmoil within. She looked at Clara, a surge of fierce protectiveness battling with a deeper, darker fear. What if this isn't just a birthmark? She murmured, her voice trembling. The meticulously controlled facade she'd maintained shattered, revealing the vulnerability beneath. The weight of her anxieties threatened to suffocate her. The sudden ring of Anna's phone cut through the silence. It was her lawyer, relaying the same message Dr. Reed had received. Liam O'Connell's legal team demanded a meeting. The chilling effect of the demand echoed in both women's hearts, a premonition of the storm gathering. Dr. Reed, back in her lab, stared out the window at the cityscape. The glittering lights seemed to mock her with their careless brilliance. Liam O'Connell's shadow stretched long and menacing, but her resolve remained unshaken. The genetic evidence was irrefutable. She would protect these mothers and their children, even if it meant facing the formidable power of Liam O'Connell. The fight had begun. The truth, she knew, held the power to shatter lives, yet also the potential to heal them. The weight of responsibility settled upon her shoulders, heavy but not crippling. It was a weight she was prepared to bear. The sterile hum of the hospital refrigerator masked the tremor in Dr. Reed's hands as she reviewed the DNA samples. The 3 infants, Leo, Clara, and the third, a baby boy named Samuel, shared an almost identical genetic anomaly. It wasn't just the birthmarks. The anomaly was deeper, more profound, hinting at a genetic manipulation beyond anything she'd ever encountered. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a discordant counterpoint to the quiet intensity of her focus. Outside, the city roared, oblivious to the scientific storm brewing within her lab. A knock echoed, sharp and insistent. It was her colleague, Dr. Ramirez, his brow furrowed with concern. "The O'Connell legal team called again," he said, his voice low. "They're escalating the pressure. They want access to the files, and they're threatening." He trailed off, his eyes reflecting the weight of the unspoken threats. "They won't get them," Dr. Reed stated, her voice firm despite the knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. The implications of this discovery went far beyond a simple genetic anomaly. This touched upon something sinister, something Liam O'Connell would do anything to bury. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Meanwhile, Sarah cradled Leo, the soft rise and fall of his chest a small comfort against the rising tide of her anxiety. David sketched in his notebook, his usually vibrant strokes hesitant, unsure. The poppy-red birthmark on Leo's shoulder pulsed faintly, a silent witness to their growing fear. "He's perfect," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. But the words felt hollow, edged with uncertainty. Across town, Anna paced her lavishly appointed living room, the plush carpet muffling her restless steps. Clara slept soundly in her bassinet, oblivious to the turmoil swirling around her. The same birthmark, a perfect mirror image, bloomed on her tiny shoulder. Anna's phone buzzed again, another call from her lawyer, echoing Dr. Ramirez's words. The pressure was mounting, the invisible tendrils of Liam O'Connell's power tightening its grip. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced her carefully constructed composure. She felt alone, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, her wealth offering no solace. The luxury of her surroundings felt like a cruel mockery of her inner chaos. The 3 mothers, unknowingly united by their children's shared secret, were about to become the focal point of a battle that extended far beyond the sterile walls of the maternity ward. The truth, like a dormant volcano, threatened to erupt, reshaping their lives and exposing the dark secrets of the powerful and privileged. The fight had begun, and the stakes were impossibly high. The sterile scent of antiseptic couldn't mask the underlying aroma of fear clinging to the maternity ward. Sarah, her eyes red-rimmed, stared at Leo, his tiny hand clutching her finger. The poppy-red birthmark on his shoulder seemed to throb in sync with her own anxious heart. "He's different," she whispered, more to herself than to David, who sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers. His usually vibrant eyes were clouded with worry. "Different how, love?" he asked softly, his voice thick with concern. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "It's just this mark, And the way Dr. Reed looked at him, the memory of the doctor's careful examination, her almost imperceptible hesitation, sent a fresh wave of unease through Sarah. Across the ward, Anna, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the plush velvet of her armchair, watched Clara sleep. The identical birthmark mirrored Leo's, a chilling echo of a shared secret. Her carefully constructed composure cracked, revealing a deep well of anxiety. The lawyer's insistent calls felt like a relentless hammer against her already fragile peace. The opulence surrounding her felt suffocating, a cage rather than a sanctuary. A single tear traced a path through her expertly applied makeup. Meanwhile, in her lab, Dr. Reed stared at the DNA sequencing. The anomaly was undeniable, a precise genetic signature repeated in all 3 infants. Dr. Ramirez's words echoed in her mind. "They're relentless, Evelyn. O'Connell won't let this go." The weight of the situation pressed down on her, a crushing burden of responsibility. The city lights blurred through her window, a chaotic contrast to the precise order of her lab. This wasn't just a scientific puzzle. It was a potential scandal, a threat to the very fabric of the privileged world she knew. Her ethical compass spun wildly, pointing in several conflicting directions. The phone rang, another call from the hospital administration. The pressure was intensifying, closing in like a vice. The fight for the truth had become a fight for her own integrity. The hum of the incubator was a constant, low thrum against the silence of the night. Dr. Reed, bleary-eyed and fueled by lukewarm coffee, stared at the 3 infant DNA profiles arrayed on her computer screen. The anomaly, the shared genetic marker, glowed an unsettling crimson against the sea of genetic code. It was undeniable. Liam O'Connell's shadow stretched across her lab, a chilling presence despite his physical absence. A soft knock. Dr. Ramirez, her senior colleague, entered, concern etched onto his face. "They're escalating the pressure, Evelyn. O'Connell's lawyers are calling every hour." Evelyn sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know, but I can't. I won't ignore this." The weight of responsibility pressed down on her, heavier than any legal threat. The ethical implications were staggering. The next morning, Sarah found herself drawn back to the maternity ward, a strange mixture of dread and defiance simmering within her. She cradled Leo, his tiny form a fragile anchor against the storm brewing around her. The poppy-red mark on his shoulder, a fiery brand, seemed to pulse with her own apprehension. Anna, her face pale and drawn, sat nearby, her usual composure shattered. Clara slept peacefully, oblivious to the turmoil surrounding her. Anna's hand trembled as she reached out to brush a stray strand of hair from Clara's face, the identical birthmark mirroring Leo's, a stark reminder of their shared predicament. "He's trying to silence us," Anna whispered, her voice barely audible above the hushed whispers of the ward. "The lawyer," he threatened. Sarah nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. Their shared fear, initially a private anguish, was transforming into a nascent alliance. A mutual understanding bloomed in the sterile environment, a fragile flower pushing through concrete. They weren't alone. Their fear, now shared, felt slightly less paralyzing. David entered, his eyes searching Sarah's face, his artistic hands fidgeting nervously. He sensed the unspoken tension, the weight of a secret they shared, a truth far greater than the mundane worries of new parenthood. The vibrant colors of his artwork suddenly seemed muted, dulled by the shadow of O'Connell's influence. The fight was far from over. The weight of the secret, once individual, now bound them together. They were facing a giant, and the first step was taken. A silent pact forged in the hushed tones of a maternity ward. The fight for their children's future, and for their own integrity, had begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the earthy sweetness of newborn skin. Sarah traced Leo's tiny fingers, the poppy-red mark on his shoulder a vivid counterpoint to his pale skin. She felt a tremor of fear, a cold dread that burrowed deep into her bones. Anna, her face etched with worry, watched her, her own daughter Clara sleeping peacefully beside her, mirroring Leo's mark. There, "They're watching us," Anna whispered, her voice barely a breath. The fear in her eyes mirrored Sarah's own. The opulence of Anna's usual demeanor was gone, replaced by a raw, vulnerable fear. "I know," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "The lawyer, his words, they're like a shadow." David, his face drawn and pale, entered, his usually vibrant eyes dulled with anxiety. He looked from Sarah to Anna, his silent question hanging in the air. The weight of unspoken fear pressed down on them, a suffocating blanket in the sterile, bright room. "They can't silence us," David said, his voice gaining strength. His hand instinctively went to his worn paintbrush in his pocket, a familiar comfort in the face of overwhelming fear. "We have to fight for them." A fragile hope, a tiny spark, ignited in the gloom. Sarah squeezed Leo's hand, a silent vow passing between them. Anna nodded, a glimmer of defiance replacing the fear in her eyes. They were three mothers, bound together by a shared secret, facing a formidable enemy. But in the face of fear, they found strength, a newfound alliance forged in the crucible of adversity. The battle had begun. The fight for their children, and for the truth, was far from over. The humming of the incubators felt less like a constant thrum, and more like a rhythmic heartbeat, a shared pulse of defiance. The sterile white of Dr. Reed's lab hummed with the low thrum of machinery. Sunlight, fractured by the blinds, painted shifting patterns on the polished steel surfaces. She stared at the genetic sequencing, the anomaly stark against the familiar code. 3 separate newborns, 3 distinct families, yet the same unusual marker. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. This wasn't just a scientific curiosity. It was a ticking time bomb. "Evelyn, a colleague, Dr. Chan," said softly, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "You haven't slept in days." He placed a cup of lukewarm tea on her desk. Evelyn barely registered the gesture, her eyes glued to the screen. "It's not just the genetics, Chin. It's the implications." She rubbed her tired eyes, the circles under them a testament to sleepless nights. "The power Liam O'Connell wields. This could expose something far bigger than a genetic anomaly." Chun nodded grimly. "The legal threats are escalating. The hospital administration is pushing for this to be hushed up." A wave of frustration washed over her. "They don't understand. This isn't about some minor medical anomaly. It's about 3 innocent children, 3 families, and a man who will stop at nothing to protect his secrets." The unspoken fear hung heavy in the air, thick and cloying like the antiseptic smell. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her. This wasn't just a scientific puzzle. It was a moral dilemma with potentially devastating consequences. She had to find a way to protect these families, to expose the truth no matter the cost. Her gaze returned to the sequencing data, a newfound determination hardening her resolve. The fight had begun. The truth, however dangerous, had to be revealed. The scent of antiseptic and baby powder hung heavy in the air of the maternity ward. Sarah, clutching her newborn son, Elias, felt a tremor of unease. His birthmark, a swirling constellation of dark moles mirroring the one Dr. Reed had described, felt like a brand. She glanced at Anna, whose daughter, Chloe, bore a similar mark, a silent understanding passing between them. Anna's usual veneer of composure was cracked, revealing a raw anxiety beneath. "It's unsettling," Anna whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Like something wrong." Sarah nodded, her own voice barely above a murmur. "I keep seeing it, that mark on Elias. It's like a curse." David, leaning against the wall, watched them both, his face a mask of worry. He saw the fear reflected in their eyes, mirroring his own. The artist's eye, normally attuned to beauty, now saw only the ominous pattern of those marks. He thought of Liam O'Connell, the name whispered in hushed tones. A name synonymous with power and ruthlessness. The coincidence felt too precise to ignore. Later, in the sterile quiet of her office, Dr. Reed reviewed the files again. The 3 newborns, each with the same distinctive birthmark, linked by an unnerving genetic anomaly. The scientific evidence was undeniable, but the implications, they reached far beyond the lab. She felt the weight of responsibility crushing her, a suffocating pressure. The phone rang, the jarring sound slicing through her concentration. It was Chun. "Evelyn," he said, his voice strained. "Liam O'Connell's lawyers have contacted the hospital. They're demanding access to the genetic data, threatening lawsuits." A cold dread washed over Evelyn. The fight she knew was coming had arrived. She looked trying to bury the truth. He murmured, his voice thick with anger. The rain intensified, the drumming a relentless counterpoint to their anxiety. Sarah's gaze drifted to her son's picture. The birthmark, a swirling crimson blotch on his tiny hand, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "What if they succeed?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. The fear in her eyes was a physical thing, almost palpable. Dr. Reed met her gaze, her own eyes filled with a determined glint. "We won't let them. I have compelling evidence. The genetic markers are undeniable. But we need more. We need a way to present this evidence that bypasses Liam's legal blockade." She paused, her expression grave. "I've been researching a colleague in Switzerland. He specializes in independent genetic analysis, outside of any jurisdiction Liam could influence." A glimmer of hope, fragile yet persistent, flickered in Anna's eyes. "Switzerland?" she echoed, her voice regaining a touch of its usual strength. "That's a long shot, but—" David closed his sketch pad, his features firming. "A long shot is better than surrender." He met Dr. Reed's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. The scent of rain and fear was slowly being replaced by something else, something stronger, the scent of defiance. The battle was far from over, but they were, at last, united. Their shared fear had forged a bond, a fragile alliance against a formidable foe. The fight had truly begun. The Swiss clinic was a haven of sterile calm, a stark contrast to the tempest raging within Dr. Reed. Sunlight streamed through expansive windows, illuminating the pristine lab where her colleague, Dr. Klaus Richter, examined the data. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced technology, a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. "The results are conclusive, Evelyn," Dr. Richter said, his voice calm and precise, the words a weight off her shoulders. "The genetic markers are undeniable. This isn't coincidence." Relief washed over her, a tidal wave of emotion that left her weak-kneed. The fight wasn't over, but this was a crucial victory. Later, in a small, cozy cafe overlooking a snow-dusted alpine village, Dr. Reed shared the news with the mothers. Sarah, usually so vibrant, was pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a haunted weariness. Anna, her usual composure fractured, nervously chewed her lip. David, his usual artistic fervor dimmed, sat silently, his hand resting on a worn sketchbook. "It's proof," Dr. Reed said, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Irrefutable proof that Liam O'Connell is connected to their children. We can take this to court now." Sarah's breath hitched. "And then what?" "He'll fight back harder. He has the money, the power." Her voice trailed off, choked with fear. Anna's voice, though shaky, held a new strength. "He won't silence us this time, Sarah. We have Dr. Reed, and we have each other." She looked at David, who nodded grimly, his eyes flashing with quiet defiance. The three mothers, once strangers united by a shared fear, now sat as a formidable force. The weight of their children's future, and the unveiling of a long-hidden truth, rested on their shoulders. But in that cozy cafe, under the warm glow of the alpine sun, they found a strength they didn't know they possessed, a shared resolve forged in the crucible of fear, betrayal, and shared truth. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, they felt a glimmer of hope, a shared determination that promised a different kind of legacy for their children. A legacy built not on secrecy and privilege, but on truth and courage. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air as Sarah, Anna, and David huddled together, a fragile alliance forged in the crucible of shared fear. Outside, the city thrummed with indifferent energy, a stark contrast to the hushed anxiety in the small waiting room. Sarah's fingers, stained with faint traces of dried milk, nervously twisted a tissue. Anna's usually impeccable composure was shattered. Her expensive silk scarf was crumpled in her hand. David, normally a whirlwind of creative energy, sat slumped in his chair, his sketchbook untouched. "He'll deny it," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning. Fear, sharp and cold, etched itself onto her face. Anna's gaze flickered to David, then back to Sarah. "He can deny it, but the genetic evidence speaks for itself," she stated, her voice regaining a sliver of its former steeliness. "Dr. Reed is resolute." David, his eyes shadowed with fatigue, nodded slowly. "But he has power, resources, lawyers who can bury us in red tape." He sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. The weight of their shared predicament settled heavily on them, the silence thick with unspoken fears and anxieties. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, a discordant counterpoint to the fragile hope flickering within their uneasy truce. The waiting room, designed for sterile efficiency, felt suffocating, a prison of anticipation. A nurse's gentle voice broke the tension. "Dr. Reed will see you now." The three parents exchanged apprehensive glances before rising, their movements stiff with apprehension. They walked towards the doctor's office, their footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor, each step a beat in a symphony of uncertainty and dread, a shared journey into the unknown. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing them in a room where the future of their children and their own lives hung precariously in the balance. The fight had begun. The sterile white walls of Dr. Reed's office seemed to amplify the tension. Sunlight, filtered through the blinds, cast long shadows across the anxious faces of the three parents. Dr. Reed, her face etched with a mixture of compassion and grim determination, placed a file on the desk. "The results are conclusive," she said, her voice low and steady, a counterpoint to the frantic beating of their hearts. All three infants share a unique genetic marker, a highly unusual mutation. Anna, her usually impeccable composure fractured, clutched her handbag. "And Liam O'Connell?" she whispered, the question hanging in the air like a fragile, poisoned butterfly. Sarah, her eyes red-rimmed, nodded slowly. "The birthmarks. They're identical to the ones described in those old photographs." The unspoken accusation hung heavy between them. David, his usually vibrant eyes dulled with exhaustion, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "But how? How could this be?" The weight of the revelation, a physical burden, pressed down on all of them. The room, despite its size, felt suffocating. Dr. Reed cleared her throat. "The probability of this being a coincidence is astronomically low. The genetic marker is linked to a specific lineage. A lineage connected to Liam O'Connell." Silence descended, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. The weight of the unspoken truth pressed down on them, suffocating. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for a glass of water, her knuckles bone white. Anna's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms. David stared at the floor, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. "What do we do now?" Sarah finally asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve. The question wasn't just about the legal battles ahead or Liam's formidable resources. It was about their children, their futures, and the profound implications of this shocking revelation. The fight for their children's future and for their own peace of mind had just begun. The sterile air of the doctor's office felt thick with the weight of their shared fear and the dawning resolve hardening in their eyes. The battle had begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic couldn't mask the underlying aroma of fear clinging to the air in the small conference room. Sunlight, harsh and unforgiving, glinted off the polished mahogany table where the three parents sat, their faces pale and drawn. Sarah, her usually vibrant eyes now shadowed with exhaustion, nervously twisted a strand of her already messy hair. Anna, her perfect composure shattered, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the delicate scent of her expensive perfume oddly incongruous with the raw emotion in the room. David, his artist's hands usually so expressive, lay limp in his lap, his gaze fixed on the worn carpet. Dr. Reed, her own weariness evident in the slight slump of her shoulders, cleared her throat. "The legal implications are significant," she began, her voice carefully neutral, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within the room. "Liam O'Connell's legal team is already mobilizing. They'll fight this." A choked sob escaped Anna. "But it's the truth," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "It has to be." Sarah's voice, raw with a mixture of anger and fear, cut through the silence. "They can't just erase this. Our children. They deserve to know." David, finally meeting their gazes, spoke in a low, strained voice. "They deserve more than to know. They deserve justice. And we owe it to them." A fierce determination, a spark of defiance, ignited in his eyes. This wasn't just about the children anymore. It was about their own fight for recognition, for their stolen peace, for something bigger than themselves. The shared understanding, a silent pact forged in the crucible of fear and uncertainty, passed between them. The weight of their situation didn't diminish. It intensified. But now it was a shared burden, a weight distributed, lightening the individual load. They weren't alone. Dr. Reed, witnessing the shift, felt a surge of both hope and apprehension. This wasn't just about uncovering a medical anomaly. It was about supporting 3 families facing a Goliath. "We need to strategize," she said, her voice firmer now, infused with a newfound resolve. "I have already contacted a specialized legal team, one experienced in cases of unusual inheritance." A sliver of light pierced the gloom. The fight would be arduous, the road ahead long and treacherous. But for the first time since the revelation, a fragile sense of unity, a shared sense of purpose, held them together. The battle had begun, but they were no longer facing it alone. The weight of the truth, though heavy, now felt bearable, shared. The fight for their children's future, and their own, had just begun in earnest. The sterile scent of the hospital hallway gave way to the earthy aroma of freshly brewed coffee in the small, cluttered office of Liam O'Connell's lawyer, Mr. Harding. Sunlight, muted by the drawn blinds, cast long shadows across the mahogany desk. Liam, his usually impeccable suit rumpled, sat hunched in a leather armchair, his face a mask of weary exhaustion. The lines etched around his eyes deepened with each passing hour. "They're relentless, Liam," Harding said, his voice a low rumble, the words barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "Reed's team, they're not backing down." Liam ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "I offered them a settlement," he rasped, his voice rough with fatigue and suppressed panic. "A generous one," Harding sighed, pushing a file across the desk. "Generosity doesn't sway a geneticist with a conscience, Liam, especially one armed with irrefutable evidence." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "This isn't about money anymore. It's about reputation, about your legacy." The word legacy hung heavy in the air, a bitter pill for a man who had spent his life meticulously crafting an image of success. The carefully constructed facade was crumbling, revealing the cracks of fear and guilt beneath. He thought of the 3 infants, their birthmarks a stark reminder of a past he'd desperately tried to bury. He'd built an empire on secrets, and now those secrets threatened to consume him. "What about the mothers?" Liam asked, his voice barely a whisper, the question hanging between them like a silent accusation. Harding's expression hardened. "They're united. They've hired a formidable legal team, one known for taking on powerful individuals. They're not settling for money, Liam. They want justice." A wave of nausea washed over Liam. Justice. The word echoed the emptiness within him, a void carved by years of calculated decisions and suppressed emotions. He closed his eyes, the image of Sarah's defiant gaze, Anna's quiet strength, and David's quiet determination flashing before him. They were not just mothers fighting for their children. They were women reclaiming their dignity, their truth. The weight of his actions, his past, pressed down on him, suffocating him. The carefully constructed world he'd built was collapsing, brick by painful brick. And in its ruins, he saw not only the loss of his reputation, but the possibility of something else, redemption. The possibility, however remote, of finally facing the truth and the consequences of his actions. The battle had begun, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, he could no longer fight it alone. The fight was no longer about control. It was about atonement. The sterile scent of the hospital hallway faded, replaced by the comforting aroma of chamomile tea in Dr. Reed's small office. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She sat hunched over a mountain of files, the weight of the case pressing down on her. The genetic evidence was undeniable, a stark, irrefutable link between Liam O'Connell and the 3 infants. But the emotional weight of her discovery was far heavier. She felt the tremor in her hand as she picked up a photograph. Sarah, Anna, and David, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and defiance, their babies nestled in their arms. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sarah entered, her eyes red-rimmed, her usual vibrant energy dimmed. She carried a worn teddy bear, its fur matted and one button eye missing. "Dr. Reed," Sarah began, her voice thick with emotion. "Liam's lawyers, they contacted me. They offered a settlement." Dr. Reed's heart sank. "And?" Sarah's lips trembled. "Money can't buy back what he took. Can't erase what my son carries. This mark, it's not just a birthmark, is it? It's a symbol of something far bigger." She clutched the teddy bear tighter, a silent plea in her eyes. "Sarah," Dr. Reed said softly, her voice filled with empathy. "The genetic evidence shows a clear connection, but it also shows that Liam, he didn't know. The implications are far-reaching and deeply unsettling." A silence settled between them, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. The weight of unspoken accusations hung heavy in the air. Sarah's shoulders slumped, the weight of her worries crushing her. "What about Anna and David?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Are they ready?" Dr. Reed nodded, her gaze hardening with determination. "We're in this together. We'll support each other. We'll face Liam. Together." A flicker of hope sparked in Sarah's eyes, a tiny flame in the face of overwhelming darkness. The fight for justice, for truth, and for their children's futures had just begun. But this time they weren't alone. They were united, their strength multiplied by shared adversity and a newfound bond. The fight wasn't just against a powerful man. It was a battle for their dignity, for their children's future, and for the truth that could reshape their lives forever. The quiet strength in Sarah's eyes fueled Dr. Reed's resolve. The battle for justice was far from over, but the tide was beginning to turn. The sterile white of the courtroom felt oppressive, a stark contrast to the chaotic emotions swirling within Sarah. She clutched her worn, button-eyed teddy bear, its familiar texture a small comfort against the looming dread. Anna sat beside her, her usually composed demeanor fractured, her eyes darting nervously towards Liam O'Connell, who sat ramrod straight, his face a mask of controlled fury. David, his face pale and drawn, sat alone, separated by the implacable barrier of the legal process. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. Liam's lawyer, a polished shark in a tailored suit, droned on about legal technicalities, his words a bland counterpoint to the raw emotions in the room. Sarah felt a tremor run through her. The lawyer's words felt like an insult, a trivialization of the profound violation they had suffered. A sudden, sharp intake of breath broke the monotony. It was Anna. She had spotted Dr. Reed, seated in the gallery, her face etched with concern. The sight of the doctor, a beacon of support in this storm, gave Anna a small measure of solace. The doctor's quiet strength mirrored their own resolve. Hope, a fragile seedling in the barren landscape of their fear, began to sprout. The judge called for a recess. The tense silence that followed was broken only by the shuffling of papers and the stifled sobs of Anna, her composure finally cracking. Sarah reached out, her hand finding Anna's, a silent promise of solidarity. The simple touch, a brief exchange of comfort, held more meaning than any legal argument. In that shared vulnerability, a bond deeper than circumstance forged itself, a testament to their shared adversity. David, observing the two mothers, felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't been as vocal, as outwardly devastated. His quiet despair felt like a betrayal, a failing. He longed to express the raw, agonizing truth of his feelings, but the words caught in his throat. The sight of his child's mark, a mirror image of Liam's own, was a daily reminder of the injustice they faced. He resolved, in that moment of shared sorrow, that his silence would break. He would fight for his son, for his family, alongside the others. As the recess ended, Sarah felt a renewed strength. The initial shock of the settlement offer had given way to a fierce determination. Money could not replace the truth, the righting of the wrong, or the healing of their wounded souls. The fight, the true battle, had just begun. The courtroom air hung thick with the scent of antiseptic and fear. Sarah's worn teddy bear felt damp with her clammy grip. Anna's carefully applied makeup was smudged, betraying the tremor in her hands. David, usually so expressive through his art, remained a statue of quiet grief, his eyes fixed on the polished mahogany of the judge's bench. Liam, impassive, seemed sculpted from granite. His lawyer's voice, a relentless drone, grated against Sarah's raw nerves. The settlement, a generous offer, amicable resolution. Each word felt like a slap. Generous, Anna whispered, her voice barely audible, but laced with bitter irony. Generous? He stole a part of our lives, our children's lives, and he calls this generous. Sarah squeezed Anna's hand, a silent agreement passing between them. The shared grief was a strange, unwelcome bond, yet also a source of strength. David watched them, a flicker of something akin to shame in his eyes. He should be participating more actively. His silence felt like a betrayal of his son, a betrayal of himself. Dr. Reed, her presence a comforting anchor in the storm, caught Sarah's eye. A small, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. It was a silent acknowledgement of the battle they were fighting, a shared understanding of the injustice they faced. The subtle shift in Sarah's posture, the barely perceptible straightening of her spine, spoke volumes of renewed resolve. The recess was announced, a brief reprieve from the relentless legal assault. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of the unspoken accusations settled heavily on the remaining participants. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the silence, the heavy silence of unspoken sorrow, of shared trauma. The sterile scent of the room felt suffocating. Anna finally broke, a sob escaping her lips, followed by another and another, until she was racked with grief. Sarah held her close, whispering words of comfort, her voice thick with unshed tears. David, finally finding his voice, reached out to touch Anna's shoulder, a silent offering of solidarity. His eyes, filled with a painful mixture of regret and determination, met Sarah's. A shared glance, understanding, and the quiet promise of a future fight. Together, the fragile seedling of hope, nourished by their shared pain and burgeoning strength, continued to grow. The battle was far from over. The truth, like a stubborn seed, had taken root, and it would blossom. The sterile scent of disinfectant couldn't mask the raw emotion hanging in the air of the small, windowless conference room. Liam, his usually impeccable suit rumpled, sat hunched over a table littered with legal documents. His face, usually a mask of control, was pale and drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and a flicker of something akin to fear. This isn't how it was supposed to be," he mumbled, his voice a low rasp. His lawyer, a slick, confident woman named Ms. Albright, remained impassive. "Mr. O'Connell," she began, her voice sharp, "we need to manage the fallout. The genetic evidence is undeniable. Damage control is paramount." "Damage control?" Liam's voice rose, a tremor betraying his composure. "They're my children. 3 of them." He slammed his fist on the table, scattering papers. The sound echoed in the small room, a stark contrast to the previous silence. Dr. Reed, observing from behind a one-way mirror, felt a pang of sympathy. She had anticipated Liam's anger, but the raw vulnerability beneath it surprised her. He wasn't just a powerful man hiding a secret. He was a man facing the shattering of his carefully constructed life. The mothers, meanwhile, sat huddled together in a separate room, a stark contrast to the sterile environment. Sarah held Anna's hand, her own trembling slightly. David, usually reserved, watched them with a mixture of concern and newfound solidarity. The shared grief had forged an unexpected bond, a silent understanding that transcended their different backgrounds and anxieties. Anna looked at Sarah, her eyes glistening with tears. Do you think he'll ever understand?" Sarah, her voice laced with a weary sadness, squeezed her hand tighter. "I don't know, Anna, but we'll face this together. Together, we are stronger." David nodded slowly. The weight of their combined grief transformed into a powerful resilience. The fragile hope, once a mere seedling, now showed signs of blossoming. The fight had just begun. The battle for justice, for recognition, for a future where their children were not defined by secrets and lies. The sterile white walls of the courtroom seemed to amplify the silence, a heavy blanket smothering the whispered anxieties of the mothers. Sarah clutched a worn, faded photograph of her baby, its tiny hand gripping her finger. The scent of antiseptic and fear hung in the air, a stark contrast to the rose perfume Anna had worn that morning, now faint and overwhelmed. David, his artist's hands restless, traced the outline of a drawing in his worn sketchbook, a sketch of the birthmark, swirling and unique, identical on all three babies. Liam sat alone at the defendant's table, the sharp lines of his suit unable to hide the tremor in his hands. His lawyer, Ms. Albright, a steely presence in crisp gray, leaned in, her voice a low hiss. "Remember the agreement. Deny everything." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the three mothers. He saw not adversaries, but reflections of a past he desperately tried to bury. Anna stood, her voice shaking, but firm. "He took something from us, something we can never get back. The right to know, the right to choose." Her gaze locked with Liam's. Years of privilege and denial crumbled under the weight of her sorrow. Sarah followed, her voice stronger than Anna's imagined it could be. "He tried to erase us, to make us disappear, but we're here. Our children are here, and we won't let him bury the truth again." She paused, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, but her chin held high. David, usually hesitant, found his voice. "It wasn't just about the money, was it, Mr. O'Connell? It was about control, about keeping your secrets safe." His quiet words carried a weight far heavier than a shouted accusation. The courtroom, still moments ago, now buzzed with a low hum of emotion, shock, anger, but also a flicker of something else, hope. The fragile hope of justice, blooming against the harsh realities of their fight. The judge, a woman with kind eyes and steely resolve, watched the unfolding drama, the weight of their collective grief settling heavily upon her. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, the tide seemed to be turning. The truth, long hidden, began its slow, inexorable ascent. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack echoing the fracturing of Liam's carefully constructed world. The courtroom's hushed expectancy hung heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and the scent of fear, mingling with the faint, lingering perfume of lilies from Anna's bouquet. She clutched a tissue, knuckles white, her composure a fragile mask over a torrent of grief and anger. Sarah, her hand resting protectively on her baby's blanket, watched Liam. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, held a flicker of something akin to fear. It was a subtle shift, a crack in the meticulously crafted facade of power. This vulnerability, however fleeting, ignited a spark of something else in Sarah, not just anger, but a sense of raw, potent justice. David, his usually expressive face pale, remained silent, his gaze fixed on the detailed sketch of the birthmark in his hand. The swirling lines mirrored the turmoil in his soul, a potent symbol of the shared trauma that bound them together. He saw not just a mark on his son's skin, but a thread connecting them to the truth, a truth Liam desperately tried to conceal. "This isn't over," Anna whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of papers and the stifled coughs in the gallery. The words, however, carried the weight of a battle cry, a declaration of defiance. They weren't just mothers protecting their children. They were warriors fighting for justice, for recognition, for the right to know their children's heritage. Sarah squeezed her hand, a silent promise of unwavering support. "No," she agreed, her voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the tremor in Anna's. "It's just begun." The shared gaze between the three women solidified their alliance, a silent pact forged in the crucible of pain and shared struggle. The courtroom, previously a cold, impersonal space, transformed into a sanctuary of defiance, where the truth, though yet fully revealed, began to blossom, promising a future where their children would know their true inheritance, a legacy of resilience born out of adversity. The faint scent of lilies, a reminder of the fragility of life and hope, lingered in the air, a subtle counterpoint to the strength that pulsed between the three mothers. The sterile scent of antiseptic couldn't mask the lingering perfume of lilies, a ghostly reminder of the courtroom's tense atmosphere. Outside, the city hummed, oblivious to the seismic shift in three families' lives. Sarah cradled her son, his tiny hand clutching her finger, the birthmark a stark contrast to his pale skin. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, but beneath it, a fierce determination burned. "He's sleeping," she whispered, her voice hoarse, to Anna, who sat across from her in the small, brightly lit waiting room. Anna's face, usually vibrant, was etched with worry. David, silent and pale, sketched furiously in a notebook, the familiar swirling lines of the birthmark dominating the page. "I keep seeing it," David murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "In every shadow, every crack in the pavement." His usually expressive eyes were dark with a kind of haunted weariness. Anna nodded, her eyes glistening. "Me too. It's everywhere. It's like a brand." A long silence fell, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock. The weight of their shared ordeal pressed down on them, a suffocating blanket woven from fear, anger, and a nascent hope. It was a hope, fragile as a newborn's breath, yet strong enough to fuel their fight. The judge's gavel hadn't ended the battle. It had merely signaled a new phase, a shift from legal proceedings to a more personal, more visceral confrontation. They needed to face Liam. They needed answers. And they needed each other. Sarah looked at her friends, their faces mirroring her own exhaustion, their eyes reflecting the storm raging within. A silent understanding passed between them, an unspoken promise to face whatever lay ahead, together. The shared trauma had forged an unbreakable bond, a sisterhood born from adversity. The lily's perfume seemed to intensify, a fragrant reminder that despite the darkness, the fragile bloom of hope still persisted. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, a seed of strength had taken root in the fertile ground of their shared despair. The sterile white of the hospital corridor felt oppressive. Sarah, Anna, and David walked in silence, the rhythmic click of their heels echoing in the hushed space. Each step felt heavy, laden with the weight of their shared secret, the unspoken accusation hanging between them and the looming presence of Liam O'Connell. The scent of antiseptic stung Sarah's nostrils, a stark contrast to the lily's perfume that still clung faintly to her clothes, a phantom reminder of the courtroom's suffocating tension. Anna, usually so impeccably put together, looked fragile, her expensive silk scarf pulled tight around her neck as if for comfort. David, his hand nervously tracing the worn lines of his sketchbook, seemed to shrink into himself, the vibrant artist replaced by a haunted shadow. They reached Liam's private suite, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the maternity ward. Rich mahogany, plush carpeting, and the muted hum of expensive technology created an atmosphere of opulent calm. A nervous-looking aide opened the door, his eyes darting between the three parents, a flicker of apprehension in their depths. "They're expecting you," he murmured, ushering them inside. Liam sat behind a large desk, bathed in the soft glow of a desk lamp. He looked older, wearier, the carefully constructed image of power subtly cracked. His gaze, usually sharp and commanding, held a tremor of uncertainty. The silence that followed their entrance was thick with tension, broken only by the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Sarah, gathering her courage, spoke first, her voice low but steady. "We need answers, Liam. About the birthmarks. About everything." Liam sighed, a sound heavy with weariness. I know you do," he rasped, his voice rough around the edges. He pushed a file across the desk, its contents still unknown. A silent invitation to discover the truth he'd hidden for so long. Anna's breath hitched in her throat. David, his hand trembling, reached for the file. The weight of unspoken accusations, unresolved grief, and the painful quest for answers settling upon them like a shroud. The air hung heavy with anticipation. A symphony of unspoken words, concealed emotions, and the impending revelation that promised to shatter their lives once more. The battle for answers had begun, and the truth, whatever its form, was about to be unveiled. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Anna's fingertips as she hesitantly reached for the file. The air, thick with the scent of old leather and expensive cologne, did little to mask the underlying tension. David's hand trembled, his knuckles bone-white as he gripped his sketchbook, its worn leather a comforting contrast to the sterile chill of the room. Sarah, her gaze unwavering, met Liam's tired eyes. His usual controlled demeanor was shattered. Vulnerability leaked from every pore. "It's complicated," Liam began, his voice a low rasp, the words catching in his throat. He cleared it, the sound echoing in the suffocating silence. My father." He paused, the unspoken history hanging heavy in the air. A subtle tremor ran through his hand as he gestured towards the file. "It explains everything." Anna opened the file, the crisp paper rustling like autumn leaves. Photographs, medical records, letters. A meticulously documented history unfolded before them, revealing a truth far more intricate than they could have imagined. Sarah's breath hitched. A photograph of a younger Liam, a boy with the same distinctive birthmark that marked his children, stared back at them. Below it, a faded birth certificate, his mother's name a jarring revelation. David's hand shook so violently that he almost dropped his sketchbook. He knew," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, a mixture of shock and dawning understanding in her eyes. The pieces were falling into place, a fragmented puzzle finally revealing its horrifyingly beautiful image. Anna's eyes filled with tears. "He kept this from us?" Her voice cracked, the controlled composure she'd painstakingly maintained since the courtroom shattered, leaving raw emotion exposed. Liam looked up, his gaze meeting theirs, a mixture of shame and sorrow etched into his weary features. "I was afraid," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of the consequences, of the scandal, of everything." He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture betraying the years of carefully constructed facades crumbling around him. "It was a terrible mistake, a selfish one. I'm so sorry." The silence that followed was less oppressive now, heavier with the weight of revelation than accusation. David closed his sketchbook, the sound a quiet punctuation mark to their shared grief and disbelief. The long-awaited answers were before them, but the path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with the complexities of forgiveness, acceptance, and the daunting task of rebuilding lives shattered by long-hidden secrets. The fight for answers was over, but the true battle for healing had just begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air of Dr. Reed's office, a stark contrast to the emotional storm brewing within its walls. Sunlight slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams, a poignant metaphor for the fragility of Liam's carefully constructed life. He sat opposite Dr. Reed, his usually impeccable suit rumpled, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue. He looked older, smaller, the weight of his secret crushing him. "The results are conclusive," Dr. Reed said, her voice soft but firm. the words hanging in the quiet room. She pushed a file across the polished desk towards Liam, the crisp paper a stark white against the dark wood. 3 children, identical genetic markers. The probability of this being coincidental is astronomically low. Liam didn't touch the file. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were dull with despair. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, his fingers catching in the thinning strands. "I knew," he whispered, his voice barely audible, the confession a heavy weight released. The years of deception, the carefully constructed lies, were crumbling around him like ancient ruins. "You knew?" Dr. Reed asked, her tone laced with a mixture of sympathy and professional curiosity. She leaned forward, her expression gentle but unwavering. "Did you know about your father? The circumstances of your own birth?" A tear tracked a path down Liam's weathered cheek, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. He nodded, the movement barely perceptible. "He was reckless," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He never wanted me. My mother, she suffered." The confession hung in the air, a raw and painful truth. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, a tapestry woven with regret and sorrow. The sunlight shifted, casting long shadows across the room, a silent witness to the unraveling of a man's carefully constructed life. Dr. Reed watched him, her heart aching for this powerful man who had been stripped bare by the truth, his carefully crafted image reduced to ashes. The weight of his actions, and the consequences, were now his burden to bear. The mothers waited, their lives irrevocably linked to this man, his past now inextricably woven with their futures. The fight was far from over, but the unveiling of the secret had begun. The sterile scent of the hospital hallway gave way to the earthy aroma of freshly brewed coffee in Sarah's small kitchen. Anna, her face still etched with exhaustion but softened by a newfound camaraderie, stirred sugar into her mug. David, ever the artist, sketched furiously in a worn notepad, capturing the raw emotion in Anna's eyes. "He knew," Anna whispered, her voice catching. The revelation hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like the humidity of a summer storm. "Liam knew all along." Sarah nodded, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And he let us live with this uncertainty, this fear, for so long." The injustice gnawed at her, a bitter taste lingering long after the coffee had been drunk. David looked up from his sketch, his brow furrowed. He wasn't just reckless, he was cruel. To us, to his own children. The words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory, mirroring the jagged lines in his drawing. A tense silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a clock on the wall, each second a heavy beat in the symphony of their shared trauma. The weight of the revelation pressed down on them, a suffocating blanket of betrayal and anger. The initial shock was giving way to a colder, harder anger, a righteous fury at the injustice they'd endured. But beneath the anger, a flicker of something else began to emerge, a tentative hope, a fragile bond forged in the crucible of shared adversity. "We need a plan," Sarah said, her voice stronger now, a tremor of defiance replacing the earlier fragility. "We need to make him accountable." Her hand instinctively went to the tiny birthmark on her baby's hand, a silent testament to their shared ordeal. A defiant gleam shone in her eyes, a spark of fire in the encroaching darkness. Anna reached across the table, her hand finding Sarah's. "Together," she said, her voice low but firm. "We'll face him together." David, his sketchbook forgotten, joined their clasped hands. Their shared gaze, resolute and unwavering, spoke volumes of a newly formed alliance, a silent vow to fight for justice, for recognition, for a future free from the shadow of Liam O'Connell's lies. The scent of coffee faded, replaced by the sharp tang of resolve, the promise of a battle yet to be fought. The sterile white of Liam O'Connell's opulent law office felt suffocating. Sunlight, filtered through expensive blinds, cast long shadows across the polished mahogany desk. Sarah, Anna, and David sat opposite Liam, his face a mask of controlled anger, his expensive suit doing little to conceal the tremor in his hand. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. "You knew." Sarah's voice, though low, carried a steel edge. The scent of her anxiety, sharp and metallic, hung in the air. Her hand instinctively went to her baby's tiny hand, tracing the familiar birthmark. Liam's eyes flickered towards the mark, a flicker of something guilt, fear, crossing his features before he composed himself. I was unaware of the full extent of the situation." His voice was carefully modulated, each word precise, yet lacked conviction. Anna's voice, trembling slightly, broke the silence. "Unaware? You orchestrated this, Liam. You built a life on deception. My child, your child, bears the same mark, the same legacy of lies." The scent of her expensive perfume, usually a symbol of wealth and security, now felt jarringly inappropriate, a stark contrast to the raw emotion in the room. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the already harsh lines of the office. David, his artist's hand restless, traced a line on his notepad. The graphite felt cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the burning rage inside him. He spoke slowly, each word measured. "You didn't just deny us. You stole our right to know, to choose. You played God." The room felt colder, the temperature dropping with the weight of his accusation. Liam leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking under his weight. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, a relentless counterpoint to the unfolding drama. His carefully constructed facade began to crumble, the perfect image cracked by the relentless onslaught of truth and accusation. The sterile scent of antiseptic, a lingering reminder of the hospital, clashed with the bitter taste of betrayal. He looked from one parent to the next, his controlled composure finally faltering. The weight of his actions, the years of deception, seemed to crush him. He opened his mouth, ready to speak, but the words failed him, lost in the echoing silence of his carefully constructed lies. The next words would break more than just silence. They would irrevocably alter the course of their lives. The courtroom air hung thick with the scent of anxiety and old wood polish. Sunlight, weak and filtered, barely touched the hushed gallery. Liam sat ramrod straight, his usual arrogance replaced by a brittle stillness. His lawyer, a seasoned shark in a tailored suit, whispered reassurances, but Liam barely registered them. He watched as Dr. Reed took the stand, her crisp white coat a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere. Her voice, though calm, held an unwavering strength. "The genetic markers are undeniable," she stated, her gaze sweeping across the room, lingering on the three families seated in the front row. Sarah, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute, clutched her baby's hand. Anna, her face pale and drawn, stared intently at Liam, her expression a mixture of hurt and anger. David, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, offered a grim nod of support to Sarah. The lawyer, Mr. Harding, launched into a cross-examination, attempting to discredit Dr. Reed's findings. He focused on the rarity of the markers, suggesting coincidence, a statistical anomaly. He spoke in rapid-fire legal jargon, trying to overwhelm her, but Dr. Reed remained composed. Her responses were precise, measured, each word carefully chosen. The scent of desperation, clinging to Mr. Harding like a second skin, was palpable. A sudden burst of coughing shattered the tense silence. It was Liam, his face ashen, his controlled facade finally cracking. He dabbed at his mouth with a handkerchief, the silk rustling against the microphone. The stifled coughs revealed a vulnerability he had carefully hidden for years, a fragility beneath the layers of power and wealth. His carefully constructed armor was visibly crumbling. The gallery held its breath, anticipating the next blow. The silence, broken only by Liam's ragged breathing, felt heavier than the weight of the accusations. The scent of fear, sharp and acrid, replaced the sterile antiseptic of the courtroom. The judge called for a recess, the gavel echoing in the sudden, deafening quiet. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah, Anna, and David exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the shared trauma and the impending revelation. Their combined scent, a blend of anxiety, exhaustion, and simmering anger, filled the air. They were no longer just mothers. They were a force unified against a common enemy, a man who had stolen a piece of their lives. The weight of Liam's deceit, finally laid bare, was suffocating them all, but a quiet strength, forged in shared pain, shone in their eyes. The recess was a chaotic ballet of hushed whispers and hurried footsteps. Sarah, Anna, and David huddled together in a corner of the hallway, the sterile scent of disinfectant a stark contrast to the raw emotions swirling between them. Anna, usually so composed, trembled, her hand hovering over her baby's tiny hand. "He coughed," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Like he's dying." David, ever the artist, noticed the subtle shifts in the light filtering through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "It wasn't just a cough, Anna. It was fear. Pure, unadulterated fear." Sarah, her eyes still red-rimmed, nodded slowly. "He's used to controlling everything. This is breaking him." The weight of their shared ordeal settled heavily upon them, a tangible presence in the silent hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous tune, a stark counterpoint to the turmoil within them. Dr. Reed emerged from the courtroom, her face etched with exhaustion but her eyes gleaming with a quiet resolve. She approached the three mothers, her presence a calming influence in the storm. "The judge wants to reconvene in an hour," she informed them, her voice soft yet steady. "We need to be prepared. He's trying to delay, to stall, but the evidence is irrefutable." Anna clutched her baby tighter. What if he doesn't confess? What if he continues to deny it all? Dr. Reed placed a comforting hand on Anna's arm. "We have the science, Anna. The truth will prevail. But we need to be prepared for his fight. It will be brutal." The scent of impending conflict hung heavy in the air, a bitter tang against the antiseptic smell of the hospital. David squeezed Sarah's hand, a silent vow of support passing between them. They knew what lay ahead, a confrontation that would not only unveil a devastating truth, but also reshape their lives forever. The hour stretched before them, a time for quiet contemplation, a period to brace themselves for the storm yet to break. The weight of the impending revelation pressed down on them, a heavy blanket stifling their breath. Yet, in their shared fear and anticipation, a newfound strength was born, a quiet defiance against the powerful man whose life they were about to shatter. The courtroom air hung thick with tension, a palpable silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Liam O'Connell sat ramrod straight, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the worn, anxious faces of Sarah, Anna, and David. His eyes, usually glittering with cold control, now held a flicker of something akin to fear. The judge's gavel, a symbol of authority, felt like a hammer poised to crush Liam's carefully constructed world. Dr. Reed watched from the witness stand, her heart a drum against her ribs. The weight of the evidence, the lives irrevocably altered, pressed down on her. She'd seen the fragility of life in the maternity ward, the fierce love in the mother's eyes, and the chilling power in Liam's calculated silence. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for truth, for justice, for the future of three innocent children. Anna's hand trembled as she clutched her baby. The child, once a symbol of joy, now represented a devastating secret. Her whispered prayers echoed the unspoken fears of the others. David, usually so expressive through his art, was silent, his normally vibrant eyes shadowed with worry. He squeezed Sarah's hand, their shared fear binding them together. Sarah, the quietest of the three, met Liam's gaze directly, her eyes blazing with a quiet fury that belied her gentle nature. "You knew," she said, her voice low and steady, cutting through the silence. "You knew all along." Her words hung in the air, a stark accusation, a testament to the strength forged in shared trauma. Liam's lawyer objected, a shrill cry cutting through the room's hushed tension. But the damage was done. The quiet defiance in Sarah's eyes, the unwavering strength in the mother's collective stance, spoke louder than any legal maneuver. The truth, long hidden behind privilege and power, was slowly, painfully, beginning to emerge. The air crackled with anticipation as the judge called for a recess, leaving Liam's carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence and the unwavering courage of three mothers. The weight of their shared burden and the promise of justice settled heavily upon them, a silent vow that their fight was far from over. The recess was a brief reprieve, a stolen moment of quiet amidst the storm. In the sterile, harshly lit hallway outside the courtroom, the three mothers huddled together, a fragile alliance forged in shared adversity. Anna, usually impeccably groomed, clutched her baby close, her silk blouse rumpled, her mascara smudged. A faint tremor ran through her body, a visible manifestation of her inner turmoil. The scent of antiseptic and fear hung heavy in the air. "He knew," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse, but her eyes burning with a fierce intensity. The touch of David's hand on her arm offered a silent comfort, a grounding force in the chaos. David, usually so vibrant, was pale and drawn, his usual artistic flair muted by the gravity of the situation. Anna nodded, tears tracing paths through the makeup on her cheeks. The birthmarks, they were never a coincidence. He orchestrated it all. Her voice, though shaky, held a newfound resolve. She looked at Sarah, then at David, their shared experience knitting them together. "We have to fight this," she said, her voice stronger now. "For our children, for ourselves." A wave of exhaustion washed over Sarah, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She thought of her baby, his innocent face, and the injustice that had been done. She squeezed David's hand tighter. "We will," she vowed, a quiet strength emanating from her. The air crackled with unspoken emotions: fear, anger, determination. The quiet understanding between them was palpable, a silent contract sealed in the face of overwhelming odds. The ticking clock seemed to mock their fragile hope, a reminder of the time slipping away, the battle yet to be fought. But in their shared grief, in their unity of purpose, a spark of defiance had ignited, burning bright against the darkness. The recess ended, and they stepped back into the courtroom, their faces now resolute, their silence more powerful than any words. The fight for justice, for their children's future, had just begun. The courtroom's oppressive air hung heavy with the scent of old wood and stale coffee. Liam O'Connell, his usually impeccable composure fractured, sat rigidly, his gaze fixed on the floor. The weight of the evidence, the damning genetic proof, pressed down on him like a physical burden. He felt the cold sweat prickling his skin, a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from the three mothers seated across the room. Sarah, her hand clasped tightly in David's, watched Liam with a mixture of anger and sorrow. Her normally bright eyes were clouded with exhaustion, but a steely determination shone through. The birthmark on her son's arm, a mirror image of the one Liam so desperately tried to conceal, pulsed with silent accusation. Anna, still visibly shaken, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Her usual composure was shattered, replaced by a raw vulnerability. The carefully constructed walls of her privileged world had crumbled, revealing a foundation built on lies and deceit. She glanced at David, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. His presence, a steady anchor amidst the storm, was a silent testament to their unexpected bond. "The testimony is irrefutable, Mr. O'Connell." The judge's voice, sharp and precise, cut through the silence. Liam flinched, his shoulders slumping slightly. He knew the game was over. The truth, like a relentless tide, had finally consumed him. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom, a wave of collective disbelief and outrage. The whispers, once muted, now swelled into a cacophony, fueling the intense emotional energy that permeated the room. The weight of Liam's actions, the profound impact on three innocent families, hung palpable in the air. Later, in the hushed privacy of a small conference room, Dr. Reed watched Liam as he finally broke down. The controlled, powerful man was gone, replaced by a trembling figure, overwhelmed by guilt and remorse. Tears streamed down his face, silent confessions etched into his ravaged features. His carefully crafted facade, years in the making, had been stripped bare, leaving behind a man broken and exposed. The doctor felt a pang of sympathy, tempered by the enormity of his actions. The road to redemption would be long and arduous. Yet, in his utter devastation, a fragile hope flickered, the possibility of forgiveness, a chance for healing. The air thickened with unspoken emotions, sorrow, regret, and a faint glimmer of potential redemption. The fight for justice was over. The fight for healing had just begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic battled with the lingering aroma of coffee in the small, windowless conference room. Liam, his face etched with the aftermath of a brutal emotional collapse, sat hunched over, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional, ragged sigh escaping his lips. Dr. Reed, observing him from across the small table, felt a surprising surge of empathy. His carefully constructed world had imploded, leaving behind a raw vulnerability that was both unsettling and strangely compelling. "The mothers, they want to meet you," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper in the charged atmosphere. Liam flinched, his head snapping up. His eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, held a flicker of fear. I don't know if I'm ready." "They deserve an explanation," Dr. Reed replied, her tone firm but understanding. "And perhaps you deserve the chance to begin to make amends." She watched him, searching his eyes for a spark of acceptance. The weight of his actions, the pain he had inflicted, hung heavy between them. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the silence. He swallowed hard, the sound a dry rasp. I destroyed their lives. I don't deserve their forgiveness." His voice cracked, betraying the tremor of his inner turmoil. Dr. Reed leaned forward, her gaze steady. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving it. It's about choosing to heal, for them and for yourself." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Think of it not as a confrontation, but as an opportunity, a chance to begin the arduous journey of reconciliation." The unspoken question hung in the air. Could Liam find it within himself to face the consequences of his actions? To confront the truth not just legally, but emotionally? The answer, Dr. Reed knew, lay not in the sterile confines of the conference room, but in the hearts of 3 women he had irrevocably wounded, and in his own capacity for genuine remorse. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him, a silent promise of the difficult path ahead. The air shifted subtly, pregnant with the unspoken hope of healing, a fragile seedling sprouting amidst the ruins of his carefully constructed life. The next step was his, a choice between remaining in the wreckage or embracing the arduous path toward redemption. The muted sunlight filtering through the blinds cast long shadows across the waiting room. Sarah nervously smoothed her already pristine dress, the fabric cool against her clammy skin. Anna, beside her, fidgeted with a loose thread on her expensive handbag, her usually impeccable composure fractured. The air thrummed with a tense anticipation, a silent symphony of fear and hope. David, his hands calloused from years of sculpting, sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the worn floral pattern of the armchair. He was the quietest of the 3, but the tremor in his hand betrayed his inner turmoil. A nurse appeared, her smile strained. "Dr. Reed will see you now." The small conference room felt colder than the waiting area. Liam sat at the table, his posture slumped, a stark contrast to his usual imperious bearing. He looked smaller, older, his eyes hollowed out, reflecting the weight of his actions. The scent of antiseptic and despair filled the air. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice trembling but firm. You knew all along." Liam's gaze flickered towards her, then dropped to his clasped hands. "Yes," he finally whispered, the word barely audible. I should have told you. Told us." Anna's voice was sharper, laced with a raw bitterness. "You stole our children's birthright. You stole their identity." David, surprisingly, spoke next, his voice low and even. "My son. He deserves to know his family." He deserves to know the truth. The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile peace. Dr. Reed watched them, a quiet observer of this raw, emotional exchange. She saw the simmering anger, the raw grief, but also, beneath the surface, a flicker of something else, a tentative hope for understanding. Liam looked up, his eyes meeting Dr. Reed's. The fear had faded, replaced by a weary resignation. "I can't undo what I've done," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to try to make amends, to tell them my story, to offer them something beyond the truth." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "It won't erase the hurt, but I can try to ease the burden." The unspoken question lingered in the air. Could these shattered lives find a way to mend? Could forgiveness bloom from the ashes of betrayal? The path ahead was arduous, but a fragile seed of reconciliation had been planted, a tiny spark in the darkness. The next chapter would be written in shared tears and hesitant forgiveness, the birthmarks a stark reminder of the unexpected connection that had reshaped their lives. The sterile scent of antiseptic couldn't mask the underlying aroma of fear clinging to the small conference room. Sunlight, weak and hesitant, filtered through the blinds, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a silent ballet mirroring the turmoil within. Sarah, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watched Liam. His shoulders slumped, his usually sharp features softened by exhaustion, a haunted look in his eyes. The carefully constructed facade of power was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. "It wasn't intentional," he rasped, his voice a low tremor. "A mistake. A terrible, unforgivable mistake, made years ago." Anna, her face etched with a mixture of anger and sorrow, scoffed. "A mistake? You stole their childhoods, their identities. How can you call that a mistake?" Her voice, sharp and brittle, echoed the icy tension in the room. David remained silent, his gaze fixed on the worn carpet, his jaw clenched tight, a storm brewing beneath his stoic exterior. Dr. Reed, observing the tense tableau, felt a wave of empathy wash over her. This wasn't just about genetics. It was about broken trust, shattered dreams, and the agonizing weight of inherited secrets. She needed to guide them towards a path of healing, even if the road was fraught with pain. "Liam's confession is a start," Dr. Reed said, her voice calm but firm, a soothing balm in the turbulent atmosphere. "But understanding the why is crucial. This isn't about assigning blame, but about finding a way to move forward." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken emotions. Sarah, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, spoke softly. "My son. He deserves to know his father. Not the man you pretended to be, but the real you." A surprising tremor of understanding flickered in Liam's gaze. David, finally breaking his silence, spoke in a quiet voice laced with weary acceptance. "He needs to know his heritage, the truth, whatever it is." He looked at Liam, his expression devoid of anger, replaced by a quiet plea for redemption. The afternoon sun cast longer shadows, the light fading, but a glimmer of something new, hope, began to emerge from the wreckage of their broken lives. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time, a fragile bridge of understanding began to form, spanning the chasm of betrayal and hurt. The birthmarks, once symbols of a hidden truth, now held the potential to become emblems of an unexpected, and perhaps even stronger, familial bond. The following weeks were a blur of therapy sessions, hushed conversations, and tentative steps towards reconciliation. The sterile hospital environment had been replaced by the warm, comforting chaos of Sarah's cozy living room. Sunlight streamed through the lace-curtained windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light, a stark contrast to the sterile conference room where their world had shattered. Anna, surprisingly, was the first to break the ice. The initial anger that had hardened her features had softened, replaced by a weary acceptance etched into the fine lines around her eyes. "I still don't understand," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper, cradling her baby close. Why did he do it?" David, his gaze fixed on his son's tiny hand gripping his finger, responded softly. Maybe, he began, his voice rough with unspoken emotions. It wasn't about malice, but about fear. Fear of losing everything he'd built. Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Liam's fear was his prison. But maybe, just maybe, he's ready to break free. The weight of their shared experience bound them together. A newfound kinship forged in the crucible of betrayal and sorrow. The birthmarks, once symbols of a hidden secret, now served as a poignant reminder of their unexpected connection. The air thrummed with unspoken questions, the weight of unresolved issues hanging heavy between them. The children, oblivious to the turmoil surrounding them, gurgled and cooed, their innocent presence a powerful counterpoint to the adult anxieties. A shared sense of hope, fragile yet persistent, began to bloom in the heart of their shared grief. The journey was far from over, but the first tentative steps towards forgiveness had been taken. The path ahead remained long and winding, but they were no longer walking alone. They were walking together, shoulder to shoulder, towards a future where healing and understanding could finally bloom. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, a symbol of comfort and domesticity, permeated the air, a subtle counterpoint to the lingering aroma of fear that had haunted their lives. The quiet strength of their newly forged bond was a testament to the enduring power of human resilience. The following weeks unfolded like a slow, agonizing sunrise. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital were replaced by the soft glow of dawn filtering through Sarah's lace curtains. The scent of brewing coffee, strong and comforting, battled the lingering antiseptic smell still clinging to Anna's clothes. She sat stiffly, her usually immaculate hair askew, cradling her baby, a tiny hand gripping her finger with surprising strength. "He knew," she whispered, her voice raw with unshed tears. "He knew all along." David, his gaze fixed on his son's sleeping face, nodded slowly. The lines etched around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and soul-wrenching doubts. He reached out, his hand brushing against Anna's, a gesture of silent solidarity. The touch, tentative at first, lingered, a fragile bridge between their grief. "He was afraid," Sarah offered, her voice gentle yet firm. She stirred the coffee, the clinking of the spoon a fragile counterpoint to the heavy silence. "Afraid of losing everything. The power, the money, everything." A low murmur escaped Anna's lips. The anger, once a burning fire, was now a dull ember, banked by exhaustion and a dawning understanding. Liam's carefully constructed facade had crumbled, revealing a man consumed by fear, a fear that had driven him to acts of calculated cruelty. "But the children," Anna's voice cracked. "They're innocent." David looked up, his eyes meeting Sarah's. A shared understanding passed between them, a recognition of the terrible injustice inflicted upon their children, yet also a glimmer of hope. Hope that perhaps, amidst the wreckage, something beautiful and unexpected could bloom. The birthmarks, once symbols of a sinister secret, now seemed to glow with a different light, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a mark of an unexpected connection forged in the crucible of shared pain. The quiet strength in their shared gaze hinted at a future where healing might be possible, where forgiveness might find a place, and where the legacy of their shared trauma would not define them, but rather shape their strength. The journey was far from over. The road ahead remained long and uncertain, but for the first time, they walked it together. The sterile scent of the hospital faded, replaced by the earthy aroma of David's small studio. Sunlight, fractured by the grimy window pane, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. He sat hunched over a canvas, the vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray despair clinging to him. Anna sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken emotions. He called. Anna finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of a nearby clock. "Liam, he wants to meet." David's hand stilled, the brush trembling in his grasp. He didn't turn, his gaze fixed on the swirling blues and greens on the canvas. I don't know, Anna. I don't know if I can," he said, He's sorry, Anna continued, her voice catching. He wants to understand, to make amends. Tears welled in her eyes, reflecting the fractured light. The weight of her sorrow, her fear, pressed down on David, suffocating him. He sighed, the sound heavy with weariness. Sorry doesn't bring back the stolen time, Anna. The fear, the lies. He turned, his eyes filled with a raw pain that mirrored her own. He saw the exhaustion etched on her face, the shadows under her eyes, the tremor in her hand. I know, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. But maybe this is a chance. For us, for the children. He looked at her, really looked at her, at the resilience shining through the grief. He saw the strength in her eyes, the quiet determination that had carried them through this ordeal. And in that moment, he saw a glimmer of hope, a fragile light flickering in the darkness. Maybe, he agreed, his voice barely above a breath. The decision hung between them, heavy and uncertain, yet charged with a hesitant hope. The road ahead remained long and arduous, but they would walk it together, hand in hand, their hearts bruised but not broken, guided by the unwavering love for their child. A love that transcended the betrayal and the pain. The meeting with Liam loomed, a daunting prospect, yet now it held the potential for something more profound than simple retribution, the possibility of forgiveness, a beginning of healing. The birthmarks, a cruel reminder of the past, now seemed to hold a glimmer of a different kind of legacy, one of resilience, unexpected connection, and the enduring power of love. The sterile scent of the hospital gave way to the earthy fragrance of Sarah's small kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Sarah cradled her baby, Elias, humming a soft lullaby. The birthmark, a constellation of deep purple, pulsed faintly beneath his skin. She traced its outline, her fingertip lingering on the delicate tracery. The initial terror had faded, replaced by a weary acceptance, tinged with a flicker of hope. A gentle knock echoed through the quiet apartment. It was Anna. The opulent furs and designer clothes she usually favored were absent. In their place was a simple sweater, her face etched with fatigue. Her eyes, however, held a newfound strength, a resilience forged in the crucible of shared trauma. He's coming, Anna whispered, her voice husky. Liam, tomorrow. Sarah's breath hitched. The news hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension vibrating between them. I don't know if I can, Sarah admitted, her voice choked with emotion. The memory of the lies, the deception, the stolen years, threatened to overwhelm her. Anna sat beside her, her hand covering Sarah's. We don't have to forgive him, Anna said softly, her voice a balm to Sarah's raw nerves. But maybe understanding is possible. For ourselves, for the children. The weight of their shared experience bound them together, a silent understanding passing between them. They weren't just mothers anymore. They were warriors, scarred but not defeated. The fear remained, a persistent undercurrent, but it was now interwoven with a fragile thread of hope, a yearning for closure, for a semblance of peace. The meeting with Liam represented a precipice, a leap into the unknown, fraught with danger but potentially leading to a fragile healing. The birthmarks, initially a symbol of shared trauma, now represented an unexpected bond, a silent testament to their collective resilience. The children, oblivious to the adult turmoil, slept soundly, their peaceful breaths a testament to the enduring power of innocence. The future remained uncertain, a tapestry woven with threads of fear and hope. But for the first time, Sarah felt a glimmer of possibility, a faint whisper of forgiveness. The fight was far from over, but together, they would face it, their hands clasped, their spirits entwined. The sterile scent of the hospital faded, replaced by the rich aroma of brewing coffee in Liam's opulent penthouse. Sunlight, filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, cast long shadows across the polished marble floor. He paced, the expensive Persian rug muffling the sound of his restless feet. The weight of the coming meeting pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of anxiety. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, the the faces of Sarah, Anna, and David haunting his dreams. He'd built his empire on calculated risks, but this felt different. This was personal. He poured himself a tumbler of amber liquid, the ice clinking softly, a jarring sound in the otherwise silent apartment. He swirled the whiskey, the amber reflecting the turmoil within. His reflection stared back, a stranger etched with lines of weariness and regret. The carefully constructed facade of power and control was cracking, revealing a man broken by the weight of his secrets. A knock echoed through the vast space. His lawyer, Mr. Harding, entered, his face grim. "They're here," he announced, his voice low. Liam took a deep breath, the whiskey burning a path down his throat. He felt a tremor run through him, a mixture of fear and trepidation. He wasn't sure what he hoped to achieve with this meeting, but he knew he couldn't avoid it. The truth, like a festering wound, had to be confronted. He straightened his shoulders, attempting to regain a semblance of control. As he walked towards the meeting room, a wave of nausea washed over him. The birthmarks, 3 constellations of deep purple mirroring his own, echoed in his mind, a constant, painful reminder of the choices he'd made, the lives he'd affected. He took his seat, his gaze drifting to the empty chairs opposite. The silence hung heavy, thick with unspoken accusations. The quiet hum of the city outside seemed to mock his turmoil. He closed his eyes, steeling himself for the storm that was about to break. He braced himself for the onslaught of anger, the torrent of accusations, and the weight of their collective pain. This wasn't just about facing 3 families. It was about confronting the ghost of the man he once was, a ghost that whispered promises of redemption, but also threatened to consume him entirely. The meeting had begun. The truth, messy and painful, was about to be laid bare. The air in the room crackled with unspoken accusations. Sarah, her eyes red-rimmed, clutched a worn photograph of her baby, Leo, the distinctive purple birthmark a stark contrast to his otherwise cherubic face. Anna, usually composed and elegant, sat rigidly, her knuckles white as she gripped her purse. David, his usually vibrant eyes clouded with exhaustion and sorrow, nervously adjusted his glasses. Liam, opposite them, seemed smaller than his imposing reputation suggested. His expensive suit couldn't mask the tremor in his hands. "This isn't about money, Mr. O'Connell," Sarah's voice, though trembling, held a surprising strength. "It's about answers, about why our children, why they bear this mark." The photograph slipped from her grasp, falling onto the polished table with a soft thud. Liam cleared his throat, the sound swallowed by the heavy silence. I understand your concerns," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He avoided their gazes, his eyes fixated on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. David spoke, his voice low and steady, a counterpoint to Liam's fragility. "Understand? You orchestrated a life of privilege while ours remained mired in uncertainty. The genetic evidence leaves no room for doubt. You knew." A raw anger pulsed beneath his quiet words, a simmering volcano threatening to erupt. Anna, her voice tight with suppressed emotion, added, "We want to know the truth, Liam, not excuses, not legal maneuvers. The truth." Her voice broke slightly, the carefully constructed wall of composure finally crumbling. Liam looked up, his gaze sweeping over their faces, a storm of emotions warring behind his eyes. Regret, fear, shame? It was a confusing mix, impossible to decipher. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The weight of his past, the carefully constructed lies, threatened to suffocate him. He swallowed, the lump in his throat making it almost impossible to speak. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint hum of the city outside, a stark contrast to the raw emotion filling the room. Then, slowly, Liam began to speak, his voice strained, his words tumbling out in a rush. His confession, a torrent of guilt and remorse, painted a picture of a man driven by ambition and blinded by his own self-interest. A picture far removed from the polished image he presented to the world. He spoke of mistakes, of choices made in a moment of youthful recklessness, choices that had far-reaching consequences. He didn't offer excuses, just a raw, heartbreaking account of his life. The confession, while not offering immediate solace, marked a shift in the atmosphere. A crack had appeared in the wall of resentment, revealing a fragile hope for understanding. The sterile scent of antiseptic couldn't mask the raw emotion clinging to the air. Sunlight, slanting through the hospital window, illuminated dust motes dancing in the stillness. Liam's confession hung heavy, a shroud of unspoken accusations and burgeoning remorse. Sarah, her face etched with weariness, ran a hand over Leo's tiny hand, her touch gentle, almost reverent. The purple birthmark, a vivid splash of color against his pale skin, seemed to pulse with a silent sorrow. "So, what now?" Anna's voice was barely a whisper, a question hanging in the fragile space between forgiveness and bitter resentment. Her elegant composure had shattered, replaced by a vulnerability that mirrored the other mothers. David, his gaze fixed on the floor, spoke quietly. "We need time. Time to process this. Time to understand." He trailed off, his voice choked with emotion. The weight of Liam's confession pressed down on them, a burden shared, yet intensely personal. Liam, his face pale and drawn, avoided their eyes. He looked smaller now, shrunken by the weight of his actions. The expensive suit, once a symbol of his power, now seemed like a flimsy disguise, unable to hide the trembling hands and the haunted look in his eyes. He reached out hesitantly, as if wanting to touch Sarah's hand, then retracted his arm, the gesture revealing a deep-seated fear of rejection. A long silence followed, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor in the adjacent room, a stark reminder of the fragility of life. The shared grief, the raw emotion, was palpable. It was a silence filled with the weight of years of deception, the echoes of a life carefully crafted and now brutally dismantled. Sarah unexpectedly spoke first. Her voice, though still laced with pain, held a hint of understanding. "It doesn't change what happened. It doesn't erase the hurt, but maybe it offers a chance to understand, a chance for something else." Anna nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Maybe," she whispered, the word echoing the fragile hope that was beginning to bloom in the aftermath of the storm. David, too, looked up, a flicker of empathy in his gaze. The path ahead remained uncertain, riddled with challenges and unresolved issues. Yet, in the shared silence, a fragile seed of forgiveness had been planted, a tiny spark of hope in the ashes of betrayal. The air, though still heavy with emotion, felt slightly lighter, a sliver of possibility breaking through the darkness. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sterile white walls of the hospital waiting room. The air, thick with the scent of antiseptic and unspoken anxieties, felt heavy with the weight of Liam's confession. Silence, thick and suffocating, settled around the three mothers and David, broken only by the occasional rustle of a magazine or the soft whimper of a baby from a nearby room. Sarah, cradling Leo, felt the tiny tremor in his hand mirroring her own inner turmoil. The purple birthmark, stark against his pale skin, seemed to burn with a shared sorrow. Anna, usually so composed, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the elegant silk of her blouse a stark contrast to the raw emotion tearing through her. She glanced at David, a silent question in her eyes. He met her gaze, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and a tentative hope. He'd seen the cracks in Liam's carefully constructed facade, the flicker of genuine remorse, and it had stirred something within him, a reluctant empathy, a hesitant forgiveness. He said he didn't know," Anna whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge between accusation and understanding. Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on Leo's sleeping face. "He said he was young, scared, that he made a terrible mistake." David spoke, his voice low and measured. "A mistake that shaped all our lives, that stole from us years, a part of ourselves we'll never get back." He paused, his eyes searching theirs. Maybe understanding can be a kind of healing. A long silence followed, a silent acknowledgement of the immense chasm between their past pain and the tentative hope beginning to bloom. The shared grief bound them together, a silent pact forged in the crucible of betrayal and the nascent flame of forgiveness. The afternoon light shifted, casting a new shadow across the waiting room, a subtle shift mirroring the internal transformations each one was undergoing. The weight of Liam's confession was still present, but its suffocating intensity had eased, replaced by a dawning awareness of the shared journey ahead, a path toward healing, however uncertain. The sterile scent of antiseptic battled with the faint aroma of lilies from a sympathetic visitor's bouquet. Sunlight, slanting through the high windows, illuminated dust motes dancing in the quiet waiting room. Sarah traced Leo's tiny fingers, the purple birthmark a stark contrast to his delicate skin. A wave of nausea, a familiar companion these past weeks, threatened to overwhelm her. Anna, usually impeccably composed, sat hunched, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. David, his artist's hands restless, nervously adjusted a loose thread on his worn jacket. He actually apologized, Anna whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The words hung in the heavy air, fragile as spun glass. David nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. A hollow apology, perhaps, but an apology nonetheless. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying his own turmoil. It was different seeing him like that, broken, vulnerable. Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting David's. A shared understanding flickered between them, a bond forged in the crucible of their shared experience. He spoke of regret, she said, her voice low, of a youthful folly, a terrible mistake. She paused, the weight of unspoken words heavy in the silence. But what about our years of worry, the sleepless nights, the constant fear? A long silence descended, broken only by the soft whimpers of a baby in a nearby room. The unspoken questions hung heavy in the air. Could forgiveness truly bloom from such deep-rooted pain? Could a lifetime of carefully constructed lies be erased by a single, heartfelt apology? Anna looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and a nascent hope. He said he didn't know about us being connected, that he was young, impulsive. He said he was scared. The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered. David reached across the small space separating them, his hand resting gently on Anna's arm. Scared of the consequences of the truth catching up. But his fear doesn't erase our pain. Sarah squeezed Leo's tiny hand, her grip firm. No, but maybe understanding offers a different path. A path toward healing. She looked at Anna, at David, and a flicker of resolution shone in her eyes. The shared grief remained, a profound and undeniable reality. But alongside it, a fragile seed of hope had taken root. The road ahead remained uncertain, but they would walk it together. The muted hum of the hospital refrigerator blended with the rhythmic squeak of Anna's rocking chair. Leo, nestled in her arms, stirred, his tiny fist clenching around a stray lock of her hair. The purple birthmark, a bruised plum against his pale skin, pulsed faintly. Sunlight, filtering through the blinds, cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the stillness. Anna's eyes, usually bright with vitality, were shadowed with exhaustion. He said he was sorry, she whispered, more to herself than to Sarah and David, who sat across from her, their own faces etched with a weary understanding. David nodded slowly, the weight of the past weeks, the revelations, the legal maneuvering, hung heavy in the air, thicker than the antiseptic smell. A hollow apology, he murmured, tracing the lines on his worn sketchbook. But an apology nonetheless. Seeing him broken, it was unsettling. Sarah, observing them both, felt a kinship, a bond forged not just by shared circumstance but by the raw, exposed vulnerability they all carried. Unsettling, yes, she agreed, her voice low, but also human. She glanced down at her son, Leo's twin, Elias, sleeping peacefully in his bassinet. It's hard to reconcile the monster they painted with the man who sat there, trembling, confessing his fears. A silence fell, broken only by the soft snuffling of Elias and the distant clatter of a hospital trolley. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, guilt, anger, and the tentative shoots of forgiveness struggling to break through the hardened soil of betrayal. Anna looked up, tears welling in her eyes. "He didn't know," she repeated, the words catching in her throat. "He said he was young, reckless. He never intended." Her voice trailed off, the unspoken implications hanging heavy in the air. The weight of Liam O'Connell's deception, his calculated actions, his years of deliberate concealment, all of it threatened to overwhelm them again. David reached across, his hand covering Anna's, offering silent comfort. "His ignorance doesn't excuse his actions," he said gently. "But maybe understanding is a first step toward healing." He looked at Sarah, a question lingering in his gaze. Sarah nodded, a flicker of resolve in her eyes. The path ahead remained arduous. The scars of the past, deep and raw, would likely never fully disappear. But in the shared sorrow, in the fragile hope blooming amidst the wreckage, they found a strength, a bond, stronger than any lie could ever break. The three of them, three mothers united by a shared trauma and a shared, unexpected future. The future of their children, born under a shadow of a secret, now bathed in the uncertain light of a tentative dawn. The sterile scent of antiseptic faded, replaced by the earthy aroma of freshly brewed coffee as Sarah, Anna, and David sat in a sun-drenched cafe across from the hospital. The morning light, filtering through the large windows, illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, mirroring the fragile hope blooming in their hearts. Elias, nestled in Sarah's arms, gurgled contentedly, a stark contrast to the tumultuous journey they had endured. "He's starting to look less bruised," Anna said, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze fixed on Leo, who was mimicking his brother's gurgles. The purple birthmark, once a symbol of their shared trauma, now seemed less menacing, softened by the passage of time and the dawning understanding. David, sketching furiously in his notebook, nodded. "The lines are softening too, aren't they? The harsh edges fading." He looked up, his eyes reflecting a newfound peace. The constant fear that had plagued him, the fear for his son, for their future, seemed to finally be receding. Sarah smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, a stark contrast to the strained smiles of recent weeks. "It's like the mark is losing its power. It was a brand, a mark of shame, but now it feels different." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It feels like a connection." The weight of Liam O'Connell's actions still lingered, a heavy cloud on the horizon. But the storm had passed. The revelation of his paternity, the legal battles, the emotional upheaval, all of it had forged an unbreakable bond between them, a connection stronger than the secrets that had been buried for so long. They had faced the darkness together. Now, hand in hand, they were walking towards the light. The cafe's gentle hum, the clinking of cups, the murmur of other conversations, formed a soothing counterpoint to the quiet strength that filled the space between them. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in months, they faced it not with fear, but with a quiet, resolute hope. The birthmarks, once symbols of a painful past, were slowly becoming a testament to their resilience, a mark of their unexpected, yet profound connection. The courtroom's hushed silence felt heavy, a tangible weight pressing down on Dr. Reed as Liam O'Connell's lawyer delivered his closing statement. The scent of old wood and polished leather clung to the air, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the hospital where this whole ordeal had begun. Evelyn felt the familiar tremor in her hands, a nervous tic she'd developed during the trial. She glanced at Sarah, Anna, and David, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and fragile hope. The weight of their shared experience hung between them, a silent testament to their resilience. Later, outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows. The sharp city sounds, the blare of horns, The hurried footsteps seemed muted, their harshness softened by a quiet sense of relief. "It's over," Sarah whispered, the words hanging in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Her voice, usually bright and cheerful, was thin, tinged with a weariness that mirrored the lines etched around her eyes. Anna reached out, her hand covering Sarah's. "Yes," she breathed, her eyes glistening. The opulent world she inhabited seemed miles away, insignificant compared to the profound connection she now felt with these two women. David, ever the observer, sketched furiously in his notebook, capturing the scene, the interplay of light and shadow, the expressions on their faces, in his usual quiet intensity. "It's not really over," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the city's low hum. "But it's a beginning." He looked up, a small smile playing on his lips. A new chapter. The purple birthmarks, once symbols of fear and uncertainty, now held a different significance, a silent mark of their shared journey. This wasn't just about Liam's actions. It was about the unexpected, profound bonds they had forged in the crucible of this ordeal. The legacy wasn't just genetic. It was a legacy of resilience, shared strength, and unexpected connection. The future was unknown but hopeful, the quiet confidence in their shared strength more powerful than any legal verdict. 6 months later, the scent of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air of Sarah's cozy kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Anna, impeccably dressed as always, but with a softer, more approachable air, sat across from Sarah, their laughter a warm counterpoint to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. David, sketchbook in hand, sat perched on a stool by the counter, occasionally glancing up with a gentle smile. "Remember those first frantic days?" Sarah chuckled, a hint of bittersweetness in her voice. The memory of their shared fear was still palpable, a ghost in the room. Anna nodded, her eyes reflecting the sunlight. The uncertainty, it was terrifying. She reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand, a gesture of unspoken understanding. "But we got through it together." David closed his sketchbook, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Your story," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "it's a testament to resilience. I've been sketching it for months, trying to capture the strength I saw in all of you." He showed them a page filled with powerful images. Sarah's determined gaze, Anna's quiet strength, the 3 babies nestled together in a symbolic representation of their bond. "It's more than a story," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's strength to be found in unexpected places, in unexpected connections." A beat of silence hung in the air, heavy with unspoken feelings. The memory of the trial, of Liam's broken apologies and subsequent quiet retreat from public life, still lingered, but it no longer held the power to crush them. It was a shared scar, a testament to the strength they discovered within themselves and each other. The babies, now babbling and giggling, played on the floor, their purple birthmarks, once a source of dread, now a subtle reminder of the unbreakable bond forged in adversity. The coffee cooled, forgotten. Their shared story, however, remained, a potent brew of resilience, hope, and newfound family. Their journey was far from over, but this moment, bathed in sunlight and the warmth of shared experience, felt like a true beginning. The hushed reverence of the medical conference contrasted sharply with the vibrant chaos of Sarah's kitchen 6 months prior. Dr. Evelyn Reed, adjusting the microphone, felt a familiar tremor in her hands. The scent of polished wood and expensive perfume filled the grand hall, a stark contrast to the earthy smell of coffee and spilled milk that had clung to her lab coat for weeks after the trial. She cleared her throat, the silence amplifying the nervous flutter in her chest. Her presentation, titled Unexpected Inheritance, a case study in genetic anomalies and human resilience, was not just a scientific paper. It was a testament to the strength of the 3 mothers. She projected a slide showing the now famous purple birthmarks, their once ominous hue now imbued with a softer, more symbolic light. The initial fear, the suspicion, The legal battles, she began, her voice steadier now, were overwhelming, but what emerged from the darkness was something truly remarkable. She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. The image shifted to a photo of Sarah, Anna, and David, their faces etched with a newfound serenity, their arms around each other's shoulders. A murmur rippled through the audience. Dr. Reed continued, her gaze lingering on the image. Their journey wasn't just about uncovering a genetic secret. It was about forging a family born not of blood, but of shared adversity and unwavering support. She described the weekly support group meetings, the hesitant smiles, the tentative friendships that blossomed into something profound. She spoke of Liam's quiet retreat, his attempts at amends, his struggle to reconcile his past actions with the reality of his 3 unexpected children. The birthmarks, she concluded, her voice filled with emotion, became a symbol not of shame, but of an extraordinary connection, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome adversity and find strength in the most unexpected places. A wave of applause washed over her, warm and genuine, a fitting end to a chapter that had forever changed her perspective on inheritance, on family, and on the enduring power of hope. The lingering scent of expensive perfume was replaced with the quieter, yet more profound, fragrance of human resilience. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Sarah's renovated kitchen, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden air. The scent of baking bread mingled with the faint aroma of lavender from Anna's hand-poured candles. 6 months post-revelation, the atmosphere felt less tense, more comfortable. A low hum of conversation filled the room. "Remember that first meeting?" Anna chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in her teacup. Her eyes, once shadowed with anxiety, now held a quiet warmth. "We were terrified. Liam's lawyers, the media." Sarah nodded, a wry smile playing on her lips. "And David, bless his artistic soul, was convinced we were all part of some bizarre performance art piece." David laughed, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the room. He'd traded his paint-splattered overalls for a surprisingly dapper sweater, his face less gaunt, his eyes brighter. "I still have nightmares about those press conferences," he admitted, his voice tinged with humor. "Though, I must say, the paparazzi did wonders for my Instagram following." A shared laugh broke the tension. The casual banter, the easy camaraderie, was a far cry from the fear and isolation that had once defined their lives. The once ominous purple birthmarks, now faded slightly, were a reminder, not of shame, but of a bond forged in shared adversity. A knock at the door interrupted their reminiscing. It was Liam. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, his tailored suit somehow looking less imposing than it had before. He carried a large, intricately decorated cake. I baked this," Liam stammered, his voice a low murmur. "It's blueberry. Your favorite, Sarah." His gaze flitted from Sarah to Anna, then to David, a mixture of apprehension and hope in his eyes. He looked smaller, somehow, stripped of the arrogance that had once cloaked him. Silence hung in the air for a moment, thick with unspoken emotions. Then, Sarah smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. "Come in, Liam," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "Blueberry cake sounds perfect." The tension began to ease. The shared silence, once heavy with mistrust, was now a space where unspoken understanding could grow. The cake, a simple gesture, was a symbol of a fragile peace, a testament to the unexpected family they had become. The journey had been arduous, painful even, but in the warmth of that renovated kitchen, bathed in golden sunlight, a new chapter was unfolding. A chapter written not in fear, but in hope, resilience, and the unexpected sweetness of blueberry cake. The medical conference hall buzzed with hushed conversations. Dr. Evelyn Reed, adjusting her microphone, felt a tremor of nervousness. The scent of expensive coffee and nervous anticipation hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just another presentation. This was her vindication, her testament to the truth she'd fought so hard to uncover. The slides flickered to life, displaying images of the 3 infants, their unique birthmarks stark against their delicate skin. "This case," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies, "challenged everything we thought we knew about genetics, about inheritance, and about the resilience of the human spirit." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The audience, a sea of faces both familiar and new, leaned forward. Later, backstage, Sarah, Anna, and David stood beside her, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride and relief. The faint scent of lavender still clung to Anna's clothes. Sarah, her eyes shining with unshed tears, squeezed Evelyn's hand. "You did it, Evelyn," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it," Evelyn corrected gently, her eyes meeting each of their gazes. Together, David, ever the artist, captured the moment in his head, the muted colors of the backstage, the stark contrast of their relieved faces against the chaotic backdrop. The memory, he knew, would find its way onto his canvas. The next morning, the newspaper headlines screamed, "The O'Connell Scandal, a legacy of lies unveiled." Liam's carefully constructed world had truly crumbled. Yet, unlike the anticipated fury, a quiet understanding seemed to prevail. He had started attending the mother's support group, his demeanor humble, his presence a silent apology. He even brought blueberry muffins, Sarah's favorite. The lingering resentment was palpable, a ghost in the room, yet it was overshadowed by something stronger, a shared experience that forged an unbreakable bond. They had faced adversity together and had emerged transformed. The birthmarks, once a symbol of shame and fear, now represented their shared strength, an unexpected family. The legacy wasn't just about the genetic truth. It was about the enduring power of connection and forgiveness. The journey was far from over, but the path ahead, though uncertain, was paved with hope and the sweetness of unexpected kinship. The scent of lilies and antiseptics still clung to Anna's clothes, a lingering reminder of the hospital's sterile embrace.